Did you know that major parts of the Constitution are not in the document that we call the Constitution? And that major parts of our revolution were fought long before our revolution? And rights were won for us by our forebears, the revolutionaries in this country, and those who fought the previous versions of the revolution in the 17th century in particular. Rights that we are losing today. And we have to win the same revolution that was fought before to get them back. The American Revolution and the people who fought it on our behalf, the founders, was following, it was actually the latest emergence in the late 18th century of a revolution which had been going on in England since the 13th century. In England, after the Norman conquest in 1066, when the Normans took over, they imposed what's called absolute monarchy, where nobody owned anything. The king owned everything. Nobody had any rights. And in Magna Carta, which was the beginning of our revolution, as the founders saw it, it was in the 13th century, the barons, who were the only ones who actually owned land at that time. Everyone else was a serf under the Normans. They reduced what had been free Englishmen to serfdom. The barons took back power from King John when he was weak, and they forced him to sign the Magna Carta, which was actually several different documents. But anyway, it's more complicated than it's often told, but that's basically what it is. And what he had to agree to in the Magna Carta was that the barons really did own their own land. They were the only landowners in England, so they were the only ones who could own land. But so people who owned land in England really did own it, and it couldn't be taken away by the king except by due process. Prior to that, the king's attitude was, I can take your land whenever I want. Your property is mine. And in the Magna Carta, he had to agree that couldn't happen. Also, he had to agree that taxes couldn't happen without Parliament approving it. So there had to be, he couldn't just unilaterally declare taxes the way the King of France still could do at that time. And the King of France still could do it well into the 18th century. Anyway, this was a big difference. But then in the 17th century, this is the part that nobody talks about in American history classes. Very important. There were two revolutions which took place in England, which our founders saw as the revolutions that they were building on in our revolution. The first one was the Civil War, which started in 1642, and they cut off the head of the king. There was no king of England for 20 years. There was what was called a Lord Protector. But anyway, in order to let Charles II, Charles I was the one whose head they cut off. And it's often said that the reason they were going after Charles was because he was trying to impose taxes, which is true, but also because he had what was called a court of Star Chamber, where he would invent his own crimes that he could accuse people of, and then in his own little pocket court, he could get people convicted. They wouldn't let his son, and also what he was doing was declaring lots of things to be criminal, but deciding that he didn't want his buddies to be accused of those things. So he would only go after his political enemies, and he was claiming the power. It's called dispensation, where there were a multiplication of lots of crimes, but the king was claiming the power not to charge people, not to enforce the law. That was what the power of dispensation was. Anyway, Charles II was not allowed back on the throne until he agreed that he would not claim the right to dispensation, and he wouldn't claim, and that he would admit that there was no right to a court of Star Chamber where he could invent new crimes to accuse people of. He had to agree to all of that before they let him on the throne. Anyway, they let him on the throne, and then his successor, James II, started violating that stuff. Now, it's often told in classrooms that the reason they got rid of James II was because he was a Catholic, but that wasn't the real reason. The real reason was he was doing the same thing Charles I had been doing. He was trying to invent new crimes and having his own bureaucrats go out there and accuse people and having them accuse them in courts of Star Chamber. He was trying to redo that again and claiming the right of dispensation, claiming the power of dispensation. And they removed him from the throne in 1689. It's called the Glorious Revolution. It was relatively unbloody as far as revolutions go, but they took him off the throne. And I'm sure you've heard of William and Mary. William was the Prince of Orange, which is in the Netherlands. He had a pretty remote claim to the English crown. Anyway, they made him the king and Mary, his wife, the queen, but they wouldn't let them on the throne unless they signed what's called the English Bill of Rights. It's in 1689. And this is very important. This is part of our Constitution, the English Bill of Rights, which most people don't even know exists. And in the English Bill of Rights, the king has to give up a whole bunch of things. And one of the things he gives up is the power of having a standing army. He's not allowed to have a standing army without having Parliament approve it. That's being violated today in the United States with the existence of the FBI. It is a standing army that does nothing but investigate people. It was created in 1906 by Theodore Roosevelt, and it's completely unconstitutional to have such a thing without the approval of the people. And there aren't supposed to be all these federal crimes that the federal government's investigating. That's another big thing that the federal government's been doing since 1906. They've been inventing new crimes. That's what they do. They create these agencies that are unconstitutional, and even though Congress is not allowed to pass laws criminalizing things, they have the agencies do it. These agencies are completely unconstitutional. Each one of them exercises all three powers, legislative, executive, and judicial. It's exactly what James Madison promised us in the Federalist 47 would never be permitted in the federal government. Because he says anyone who possesses all three powers, it's the quote unquote very definition of tyranny. Our Constitution, the whole reason we have three separate branches of government is none of them is allowed to have all three powers. Each of them only has one power. There's the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. And the judicial branch is the only one that's allowed to impose punishments on people. But we now have all these agencies that do that. They impose fines on people. And some of these fines are millions of dollars. Anyway, I'm going to show you some of the language in the English Bill of Rights, and you'll see that this is stuff that's been violated now. It's been getting violated by the presence of those administrative agencies. And what's very important to know is in the Declaration of Independence, just examples of some of them. Some of the things that he was accused of doing wrong, erecting a court called the Court of Commissioners for Ecclesiastical Clauses. What this was the king was removed from the throne. This is telling the things that James II did wrong that William and Mary agreed not to violate. James II was inventing these additional crimes that he claimed were moral insults. That's what all the environmental laws that we have are. The civil rights laws, in fact. They're saying this is a moral imperative that the federal government has to enforce, and it supersedes all other law, supersedes all property rights. Environmental laws take away your right to use your own property, just like zoning laws do. And this is what the King of England had been doing, James II, and William and Mary had to promise not to do. I'll show you the language. You'll be reading it. Anyway, that's one of the things. And they were also, he was claiming the right to disarm Protestants. The right to bear arms was very important. And that's one of the things that he was trying to disarm Protestants, but not Catholics. This was part of the dispensation stuff. And anyway, William and Mary had to agree to renounce the power of dispensation and not to interfere with anyone's right to bear arms, on any basis, whether they were Protestant or not. Of course, they were Protestant, so that wasn't an issue. But they couldn't do it to Catholics either. And anyway, you'll see the language. It's right out of some of the stuff that's in the Bill of Rights, but it's also stuff that is all incorporated by reference into our Constitution. And the reason for that is these are the very rights that the colonists were fighting the British over violating against us in the Declaration of Independence. In the Declaration of Independence, the second half of the thing is what's called a Bill of Particulars, where they enumerate all the violations the king is doing against the colonies, the reasons why they were declaring independence, because the king had gone so far in violating their rights as free Englishmen that all they could do was declare independence. It was things like, he has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out our substance. That's exactly what those administrative agencies that we are now stuck with doing are doing. We have to fight the same revolution that was fought in the 17th century and that our forefathers were assuming was part of their revolution. They didn't even have to mention this in the Constitution. And the reason for that is because the Declaration of Independence is declaring their right not to have these things imposed on them as a matter of their natural rights. And it was recognized by the Supreme Court in the case of Allgaier v. Louisiana that all of the rights that the Americans were fighting the British to retain that are enumerated in the Declaration of Independence, things like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but also all this other stuff. That's all part of our Constitution because of the 14th Amendment. So even though it's not in the document we always call the Constitution, it is in fact there. And there's one other very big one that's not in the Constitution, and that is what's called the dead hand law, the law that, quote unquote, one legislature may not bind the legislative authority of its successors. And that's been accepted by the Supreme Court in United States v. Winstark as part of our Constitution. And that's being violated now by the filibuster rule. Filibuster rule prevents the repeal of prior legislatures' legislation. So we're living under the tyranny of the violation of all these things that our forefathers fought over. Again, I'm going to show you the text of some of this stuff in this video, but I want you to know that our revolution was unique. It was different from the French Revolution. It was not just a nihilistic expression of anger at the existing way things are and just wanting to start from ground zero. That's what the French Revolution was. They decided they were in year one, that history began with them, and they were just a clean slate. And of course, they had to kill thousands and thousands of people. It was just a nihilistic mess. It was horrible. And the French are still living under a version of it, by the way, today. We are not. The English Constitution and the English Civil War, which our revolution was the final expression of, was a war for the independence of the individual, liberty of the individual, and that's what our revolution achieved in a way that the English never had previously. Our revolution wanted to underline and retain and insist on all the rights that the English had obtained previously, and then new rights were added, a new independence. We don't have a king, and we have a Congress instead of a parliament. It's a much better form of government. We have a republic. The English don't have a republic. And the Republican form of government involves the elected officials voting by majority rule. That's what, and it's in the guarantee clause of our Constitution that we are guaranteed by the United States. That's not the United States is not the federal government. It's the states themselves. The 13 states and the citizens. The signers of the Constitution, guaranteed to all of us a Republican form of government with all of these rights and liberties that had been obtained by the English over all those years, beginning in the 13th century. I'm Cliff Ribner, and if you like listening to me, please do so and let other people know about me.